Hey everyone, how's it going? I recently did a play in sealed on Arena, and they had a pool that I thought was pretty interesting and that maybe some people might find useful to see sort of how we go about building it. I heard there's like some kind of sealed qualifier or something coming up too, so maybe this will be useful to anyone who's studying up for that or trying to prepare for it. We'll also cover some like of the general differences between sealed and draft, and sort of what thought process goes into inclusions and kind of our deck construction. So the first thing just to mention before we jump directly into the building is I think that one of the biggest mistakes I see people make when they're building sealed pools is that they do not spend enough time doing so. So like, I think, and I'm sure maybe there are people who disagree with me, but I think that sealed pools, even for people with a lot of limited experience, are very difficult. And I often see people where they'll at a glance say, okay, I want to try these colors, and maybe they do try like a couple different versions, but they don't really delve into the specifics of what cards they want to include and why. And I think sometimes it takes a lot of time to really get a feel for how everything interacts in your sealed pool, and it can be very difficult to find the right build, I guess is what I'm getting at. And I think that if you're playing in a competitive environment where you're trying to win, like the qualifier where you may only have like one chance to spike, whatever the max wins is, I don't really follow it that much. Again, your time is really well spent in spending 30 minutes building your pool or whatever you need to do. All right, so that said, really quick still, just some comments on some general differences between sealed and draft as far as the mindset goes. I think it's understood by a lot of people with limited experience that sealed is on average going to be a bit slower than draft because you have less streamlined decks. You don't get to kind of craft your deck in a way where you're choosing your like cards with respect to curve and so forth. You kind of are just, here's a pile, deal with it. And so in addition to it being slower, I think it's important to think about what that means as far as cards being better or worse than they might be, since I think a lot of people have more experience kind of in their internal calibration with draft than with sealed. So like, for example, if I were to go to colors here, I think for Vampire Spawn is a good example. I think it's sort of understood at this point that Vampire Spawn is a pretty solid like draft card. And that's I think a big reason of that is because your 2-point life gain matters more, and I guess drain, not just the gain, but matters more when there's a tempo component to it, which, again, not to say it doesn't matter in sealed. I think Vampire Spawn's still a perfectly fine sealed card, but I think it's a little bit worse in sealed than it is in draft, because in draft, gaining 2 and having a body to block on the draw, or being able to deal 2 and also have a body to pressure on the play, right? It matters more because the decks are more streamlined and because they're going to be curving out more regularly. And so the fact that its body, a 2/3, is not super exciting, or the fact that its impact isn't huge, is less important, because what matters is the timing element of it, right? It keeps you alive or it helps you push. Whereas something, for example, like Pilgrim's Eye, I think goes way up in sealed compared to draft. Again, not a bad draft card by any means, but Pilgrim's Eye, first of all, gives you more flexibility in your pool. It lets you include splash cards, which is a huge benefit and very a common thing to do when you're building a sealed pool. And if you think about the downside of Pilgrim's Eye, what are the parts that make it bad? Well, it's a 3-mana 1/1, right? And again, there's a tempo element to that, because if you're not developing your board strongly in draft, you're more likely to get run over. Whereas in sealed, you can just say, all right, I'll take my 2 for 1, right? You get a 1/1 and your land. It fixes for you. It makes you helps you hit your land drops where your curve is going to be a little higher anyways in sealed. And so yeah, I think Pilgrim's Eye goes up substantially. Another example, counter spells, I feel like, are in general a little better in sealed. You still have to build your deck in such a way that it supports leaving mana up, but I think that like the idea to just counter something and say, okay, well, you only have a handful of rares in your pool, and when you cast them, I have the option to just counter it. That's pretty huge. Not to say that you should always run them, but these are things that I think that really should be considered when you're evaluating your cards in your pool, even before you get into your colors and building your deck. I think that adjusting your card evaluations can be pretty important. All right. So that said, let's go ahead and take a look at some of our rares. So here we usually start off looking at rares just because, again, it gives you some direction of what things you want to play if you can. And so here we got Ancient Bronze Dragon, this dragony thing, green-white dude that's decent, but again, not by no means game-breaking. And some red stuff, red-green dude that gives you the bonus with mana creatures, Fiend Lash, Outcasts. So nothing that's like game breaking, but some strong cards if I end up playing them. Again, being a little slower, the 7-drop is more palatable than it might normally be in draft. And then again, I do have some dragon stuff going on, so not bad. The next thing I would typically take a look at is from colors, look at what my removal looks like. Because I think a general rule of thumb for sealed is that you want to play your best cards and you want to play your removal. And I know it sounds kind of dumb, because of course you're going to want to play your best cards and of course you're going to want to play your removal. But I think that like some people, I guess I would disagree with the extent to which some people are willing to forego doing that in order to have like a larger volume of good cards. So for example, let's say I don't have removal in white. I think I do have removal in white, but let's say I didn't. And let's say I had a stack of like 15 great white cards that I would play that, are decent, good playable white cards, but it's missing removal for whatever reason. And then I also have maybe like some green creatures and like, okay, cool. I can play like one removal spell, and I can have like a very solid looking deck, but let's say I would forego having played, one of my strong bombs, because I didn't have that many cards in that color. I feel like that's a little bit of a trap that sometimes people fall into, where you end up not being able to pressure hard enough, and then at the end of the day, your opponent's going to have a card or a couple cards that you just can't deal with and are stronger than everything that you have access to. So again, I think for me, it's a very high priority to try and play my best cards and try and play my good removal. So that said, if I'm looking at where my removal is, so I have a Humiliation, which I think is an example of a card that might be a little worse in sealed than draft. I'd imagine it's still quite good, so I'm not super, it's not like I'm down on it. But like, for instance, your creature count might not be as high, your curve might not be as tight, meaning that you're not going to have as many onboard creatures necessarily. And I guess the losing abilities part can still be really huge. So again, I'm not trying to talk down Humiliation, but just the scenarios where it's going to be at its best, I think are less common, because again, the fact that it's 1 mana means you can pressure a lot in draft, and in sealed you might not as often have the ability to do that. Not that you wouldn't be able to, but anyways, so Humiliation, Guiding Bolt, Hippogriff, not exactly removal, but the front side can serve as some interaction. Containment, which I'm not huge on. I think it's better to have something like Containment than have no answers to things, because like at some point you're going to need to answer great cards in your sealed run, and if you have nothing, that's really rough. But at the same time, ramping and fixing your opponent in sealed is like a pretty huge cost to pay. Something on watch, so I have some decent white removal here. Blue, I have some counter spells for some interaction, but not much. And at a glance, just while I'm looking through here, I also notice I'm not too keen on my blue. I don't think that I'm going to be playing like blue as a main color, because just the power level doesn't seem to be here. There's not interaction. Oh, I have Charm Sleep too. So again, it's not something that I'm actively going to be looking to include, but I do notice the inclusion of 3 blurs, and so I'll keep an eye on that too. If I notice, a lot of useful ETB stuff, then, maybe I'll keep this in the back of my mind. Sorry to get sidetracked, but really quick also, one thing I would suggest doing too, is start to look for observations you can make about your pool. What does it do well? What is it missing? Is there anything unique about it that it can do that you might be able to build around? So like right now I'm just trying to pick out my removal, and I got sidetracked by this, but it reminded me that if you can notice things about your pool that you think would suggest to build it in a certain way, that can help streamline your process a bit more. because then you can notice, oh, well, I have, some great dragon synergy stuff. So if I have some of like the dragon cards, like the one that ramps and gains 2 life, or maybe you're like, oh, I have some good cards, but they're spread out in multiple colors. You can say, oh, do I have fixing? And you actively go out and look for it, like Pilgrim's Eye. And so that can help you in sort of streamlining your process. That said, though, back to our removal search. In black, Eye of the Beholder, I think a little better in sealed than draft, where I think it's pretty abysmal in draft, and it's maybe like a little below okay in sealed. But Grim Bounty is great, and Cast Down looks great. Also noticing, by the way, Cast Down, great and 1 mana pip. So again, I'm expecting that I will play this almost 100% in every build that I make, because it's splashable, it's great removal, and I already know that I have some fixing available to me. So looking over here, red cards, I got Dragon's Fire, some weaponries, and Breath Weapon is interesting, and this thing, not this one, Enthusiasm. So my red removal is actually pretty decent. The weaponries, again, have fixing, which is nice. If I don't have a good curve, the Breath Weapon is a good kind of fail-safe. And again, the Enthusiasm is great. So red removal is looking pretty decent. And green, so this is kind of concerning, just another observation as we go. So I have a green band together as far as removal goes, but I noticed my card count in green is quite low. And most of my good cards, or my best cards, have green in them. And also, it's kind of unfortunate because this Raga Draga sort of wants things with mana abilities. I don't have any like Myconids or the Ramp Dragon dudes or anything like that, so it's a little tough. But okay, so I notice that I have my best removal is in black, so I'd like to maybe try and build something in black, but trying to think about what is my black missing. So it has great removal. It doesn't have a very good curve. I have a Prowler, which is a great 2-drop, but other than that, I have nothing on 2. But I do have some Vampire Spawns that can kind of make up for that, right? They gain some life, so I don't fall too far behind. So, my black is looking pretty decent. I don't have much in the way of black rares. I have a Kalain for black-red if I go that direction, but yeah, I'm not sure that black-red will have the power. Maybe I can splash some of the green stuff, but yeah, let's see where it goes. And I noticed that I have some good white cards, like Guiding Bolt I think is quite good in sealed. Here, I'll include Humiliation. So now I'm going to start actually experimenting with some builds a bit. So having made some observations, I noticed I had some white cards that I wanted to play that looked good. Hippogriff is great. Yeah, I'll leave Containment here for now. I can always include it later. And the Unicorn, I'm not especially excited about. 3 mana, 3/2, but sometimes you'll end up with things that you just kind of have to play to make card count. So I'll just throw it in there and I'll remove it if I need it. So the removal can come in. My guess is if I play a white-black version, I don't need the eyes because I already have multiple ways to remove like kind of big creatures that are quite good. And so I don't need to be playing another one. My deck already kind of has access to that. So let's see what this looks like. Yeah, probably Grim Wanderer. I have some cheap removal, and so I don't think it should be too much of a problem getting it online. I expect I'm always playing these Pilgrim's Eyes, so I should throw those in too. If I have the Pilgrim's Eyes and like a Prowler, maybe I want the Chain Devil, right? Since I have things that I can sack that have already kind of done their job. Manticore, kind of similar to Chain Devil, but it feels like it does it worse. I'd rather not include it, but we'll see what it looks like. This one, I don't see anything as far as like any graveyard stuff here. I remember from green I had some graveyard stuff, but it wasn't things that I felt like were a huge draw to go into that kind of deck. Right, Summon Undead maybe, but yeah. So as far as black and white cards that I more or less want to play, I'm looking at these 20 about. And so if I look at something like this. So just moving stuff away to look at only like my 2s and 1s. So this is something that I've seen people do where they'll like, oh, I have I have a few early drops and I have some cheap removal if I stall, right? Or like if I don't have 2 drops. And so they would consider that like, oh, I have a decent curve and I can play this kind of deck. But for me, there's a little bit of a problem here in that even though I have good removal, I don't really know if I can win like a long game playing this kind of deck. Some things that stood out to me are if I am relying on my removal as like my top end, which I think is fine. Like you can do that and it can be okay. But if I'm doing that, then how am I winning the game after I deal with everything, right? So first of all, my cheap removal is kind of serving double duty because it has to be interaction early on and I would want it to kill things later. So it's a little bit taxed, right? So the way the games play out, if I have to use like a cast down on turn 2 to kill like a Soldier of the Watch or something, then I'm not going to have that cast down when they play like their Giant Dragon or whatever, right? So like I'm not super enthusiastic about that plan. And also, again, I just don't have the power that can compete with a lot of things. And that would be okay, except I also don't have a lot of card advantage, right? So if I had some means of like drawing a lot of cards, so now I'm going to go out and look and see, is there a way that I can draw cards? Because trading 1-for-1 with your removal and then having threats that are maybe kind of mediocre at best, I don't think is a good way to get it done in sealed. If I can remove their best creatures and draw cards to pull ahead, then that's a strategy we can start to look into. But at a glance, I don't like the build of this, even though it has a handful of good cards. Right, again, we talked about Vampire Spawn. I dislike... dislike is not the right word. I was gonna say I like it less in sealed than I like it in draft. So again, this isn't as huge of a draw as it might have been if it were like a draft deck. And then again, I don't like the plan of this deck. And so for me, having said that, I don't see a nice way to fix it either, right? I don't have great ways to generate a lot of card advantage. Specifically, not just card advantage actually, but I'm looking more for card draw than card advantage. So like for example, I have the two Pilgrim's Eyes, and I could splash like a Druidic Ritual if I was just interested in pure number of cards. But the difference being that the reason I need card draw is because I need access to my removal in order for this deck to work. And I also want to be ahead of cards to do so. So like, if I don't have access to my removal, then again, I'm just likely to die to something that's more powerful than what I have access to. So looking through, that even suggests like I could splash something like Contact Other Planes. I think it fills a role in this deck that, that kind of this deck really needs. But at the same time, I think I probably have better versions than this. I'll keep this in mind. Good removal and maybe some splashed card advantage. I might be missing some, I'm not sure, but I didn't see any other like great ways to pull ahead on cards, specifically as we said, like drawing cards. So at a glance, I think this would be something like this build. I might include, if I were to try and like finish it up, I don't know, I'm not too enthusiastic. I guess I could throw in the Ghost Lantern, but I haven't really been a huge fan of this thing. The equip side of it feels like it just doesn't get it done to me just from having played with it. And so I'm not super huge on it. But okay, so let's go ahead and see if we can look at something else. And again, as I mentioned, like this is going to be kind of a long one. Feel free to skip around if you're only interested in certain build colors from having looked at the cards. But yeah, this is just sort of how I would build. I would spend time doing it, and I kind of want to outline that process. So okay, white has some decent interaction and some decent curves, but is lacking a little on power level and card advantage. If, let's say I wanted to maybe try... Well, okay, so green has my power in it, but it doesn't have a large volume of cards. And so if I wanted to try something like green-black, because then I have removal, and then I have a little bit more higher top-end stuff. So let's say I played Eyes and Grim Bounty. Just throw in the decent, and maybe this mill card will be more defensible. Maybe I can play the Druidic Ritual and use this sort of as like a mini tutor, right? Because if I'm milling more, then the Druidic Rituals can help me find like my good cards. So here. Maybe the Grim Wanderer. Again, Grim Wanderer less good because I think my curve might be a real issue in this version of the deck. So if I guess I still have the Pilgrim's Eyes, of course. So maybe still with the Chain Devil. And then I have access to splash any of these things if I want them. But let me see sort of what this looks like just at a glance. So I have 16 cards here. If I sort by curve. So I don't have 2-drops. I have really... there should be a Prowler somewhere. Yeah. I don't have 2-drops. My removal is probably a little worse than the white version. It's certainly less efficient. And this Summon Undead is kind of suspect, given that I only have 12 creatures in total. Of course, I still have to add a bunch more cards, so there's that somewhat issue too. The curve being low is not super huge because I have the vampire spawns. But something about this format in particular, by the way, I'm less excited about trying to block as a means of early defense than I am about removing stuff if I can. So like, for example, to compare, in draft, I think that Vampire Spawn is significantly better than Improvised Weaponry. But in Sealed, I think that gap closes substantially. Because if, for example, consider the two scenarios where like my opponent plays like a 2-mana 3/1. I try and block it with a Vampire Spawn versus I just like Improvised Weaponry it. In this version, it fixes my mana, helps me be more consistent because I'm expecting probably I'm going to have some splash colors. And then if you have the Vampire Spawn, and this has been happening all format, right? How often do you play a blocker and then they go creature, humiliation, swing, and you take like 4 damage, and then you play another blocker, and then like, you know, if they have something to follow up, or they have a trick or something, then you're in trouble. Or how often do you play a blocker and you go, okay, I'll trade with your 3/1, and they go 1 mana Hippogriff, and then play a follow up, and then now you're down on cards and you're down on the board and you took some damage. Like, blocking in this format to me is not something that I'm actively looking to do. And I know those examples, by the way, are only against specifically white decks, but I feel like a lot of times the format goes that way, where like the person on the play is applying a lot of pressure, and I'm not super enthusiastic about blocking. Green, for example, has the +3/+3 trick. I don't know, no one plays blue. But yeah, I guess my point being that I'm just haven't really been finding good experience, whereas comparatively, imagine you just remove their 2-mana 3/1, you get a treasure back, and then the next turn you get to play, if you have one, like a 5-drop, right? Or you get to fix your mana, and their tricks aren't going to be as effective necessarily because, again, you're not engaging in combat. So that said, again, all that to say, like, Vampire Spawn is not a bad card. I feel like I'm kind of like talking trash about it when it's not by any means bad, and it's something that I would include in any version of my black decks here, I think. But you know, I think there are some downsides to it, and also that yeah, for the reasons we said, it's not as good in Sealed as it may be in draft. That said, I do have kind of a playable issue here, right? Because I have 12 creatures, meaning some of these cards are not very optimized anyways. And I could, if I do the green-black version and I want to play this, because as we said, this is one of my better cards. This is a 6-mana 6/6 ward flyer, which is great. And then it has some upside on top of it. So I'd like to play this Miriam, but in green-black, I don't have enough fixing because I don't have the I only have the Pilgrim's Eye, I think. And I don't have anything else that like makes Grim Bounty, I guess, helps a little bit. And also, this would be a double splash, right, if I'm playing green-black. And so, I mean, I have some stuff, Drider, Manticores, but I don't have a lot of, like... So, I have the Pilgrim's Eyes, like we talked about earlier, but the cost of that is kind of high, because Manticore is not a card I'm actively looking to play. Just a 4-mana 2/1. Poison the Blade I think might be fine, but my creature count's pretty low in this version, which I'm not happy about. So yeah, I think this version has some good things going for it. Has is decent removal, has the top end. It can have some card advantage with the rituals, but again, my creature count's low enough that this isn't always card advantage. And same thing here, the Summon Undead it might not always be turned on. And so, while I think this does have some good things going for it, I think we don't have the card count to get there, and I don't think that splashing in the green-black version is going to be where I want to be at, given that I don't have access to a bunch of means of splashing. So I discounted this version for that reason. So the next thing I would try is like maybe a red-green version. So a couple things to notice here. Firstly, from a card count perspective, like I mentioned, a lot of my power is in green, like my top end cards, but my card count is low. And at a glance, just from pure count of numbers, I have a lot of red cards. And I also noticed from earlier when I did my kind of inventory of my removal that I have some good removal in these colors. In particular, the Dragon's Fire and the Enthusiasm. So I have some things here that can maybe work out for me a little bit. So let's see what happens if we start putting the green-red part together. So Circle, Druid. Oh, I might have left this out of the other version, the black one. I would probably end up playing this just as like a random body. But let's see where this ends up. So if I'm playing green-red, then I got those for sure. I can't imagine I'm not playing this, especially I'm playing the 2 Pilgrim's Eyes. And then the War Colors I feel like are not quite where I want to be. They might be decent. I even have some Iron Golems if I want to go that route. But again, I really want to be careful that I don't end up in like this sort of in-between strategy where I'm trying to beat down, so I have some of these cards in my deck are 1-mana 1/1s, but I don't have enough pressure that my opponent has to respond to my beatdown, right? Notice there's a huge difference in hasting out a 5/3 when you've curved out 1, 2, 3 already and you have the board. And versus if you play a War Caller and you skip your turn 2, or you use a removal spell on their thing and you hit for 1, and then like your turn 3 is a Pilgrim's Eye, and then you haste out an Iron Golem, then it's like significantly less exciting, and the pressure is not quite there. So I'm not sold on these at the moment. We'll see where they lead to. Similar with the Outcasts, I know that they're a form of card advantage and they're cheap and they can pressure, but I don't know if I'm going to have the tools to do that here, and so I'll keep it in mind to see if I want to include it. Extraordinaire, well, it's again oftentimes an aggressive card. It also creates a treasure, which I think matters here. Here I'll have some big bodies maybe at the top of my curve, so having some card advantage here is a means of fighting. Weaponries, I mentioned that I kind of like for the reasons we discussed, and they fix my mana. Breath Weapon, just because I don't suspect my curve is going to be super great. Battlecry Goblins, just generically good here. Reckless Barbarian. So I noticed, so I'm not a rules savant, but I think that this is a mana ability. And so just for like some nice incidental interaction, I think with this thing, this might be a 4/4. Someone, if you guys know the rules and because it didn't come up in my games at all, then I'd be interested to hear. But I think that works. So put that here. Enthusiasm definitely gets in. This Fiend Lash, I don't really like that much. My creature count doesn't look like it's going to be super high. It won't be bad, like 13. I'll probably find something else to throw in. But it's not, yeah. It's not like it's optimized in my deck, and even then, 5 mana is a lot to give this effect. Maybe I actually maybe didn't consider the fact that it gives reach enough when I made my decision building this. I didn't include this in my final version just because, like I said, even with sealed being slower, 5 mana is a lot to me, and you spend it to do largely not that much, right? Like it gives +2/+0, and they could just take a hit from something. If I'm attacking with something really big, then they're probably dying by me hitting them with it anyways. And if I'm attacking with something small, and I've spent 5 mana equipping this, they probably can just take the damage and kill me faster than I kill them. So I don't really like this card that much in general. But I did notice that, again, flying is a big deal in the sealed formats a lot of times, and so maybe I didn't give the reach enough credit. I don't know if I would include this still, but definitely something to think about. So that said, let's look at what this base looks like. So I have cheap removal, right? Just removal for small things. So my curve is mostly okay. This one can hit larger things and is very efficient. Dragon's Fire, very similar. Note that I have multiple large dragons, so this is like a actually very strong removal potentially. And the band together is decent. I have like solid sized creatures. So let's see. Oh, and I'd mentioned earlier that I'm probably including in any version the cast down, and I think that's going to be the case. So I noticed, yes, this is a double splash. I have a blue and a black. But if I count my sources, right, so I have 2 Pilgrim's Eyes, and then I guess it's removal pile, and then 2 improvised weaponries. So that's like 4, and then presumably I'll play like 1 basic of each. So let's say 5 sources from each for my splash, I think is more than enough. And so like my splash is not even that ambitious, I think, with a double splash. Also, I can kind of help it. I need some playables anyways, so in goes the Young Red Dragon. So here we got Makes Treasure. This card is not something that I am happy about putting in my deck, but I do think it's somewhat unplanned. It can ramp me to the bigger ones if I need to. It does have some interaction with the this guy. Again, I can kill them maybe 1 attack sooner than I would otherwise be able to, just trying to beat down with Young Red Dragon. Yeah, I'm not excited about it, but I need playables if I'm going to try and make this version work. You meet in a tavern. Again, I don't think my player or my creature count is high enough to do this. Either for either mode really. The look at the top 5 or the +2 version. And so here I throw in the Poison the Blade. Again, it cycles, helps me be a little more consistent. And I think it's decentish with the Pilgrim's Eyes. And seeing as I have the Poison the Blade, I noticed that as a last inclusion, I think I can put in this Trap Finder. It seems weird, but there's 2 things that I noticed about it. Firstly, just the obvious being like, okay, there are 3 ones in the format. And so being able to just represent a block on a 3-1 is nice. But I also noticed that if it dies, a decent number of my cards have relevant ETBs or are good with this sort of cheap haste scenario, right? So like, for instance, if I use this and seek a Pilgrim's Eye, that's a good way to just generate a land with the ETB, right? So that's not so bad, especially because I have some expensive things that I'm going to want to be casting here. If I seek the Extraordinaire, again, I get a treasure with it, and the potential to double strike if I have something big. If I get Battlecry Goblin, right, this card costing like 0, or 1, I guess, it costs red. Yeah, 2 less to cast. So this card just casting 1 red though, so for 1 mana and already having haste, so you don't have to activate when you play it, is kind of a big game, right? Because then you get to probably activate the Pack Tactics and have a pump at least, maybe more afterwards. And then the Reckless Barbarian is actually just like a little mini like ramp card if I get it kind of for quote unquote free off the Trap Finder. So like the Trap Finder is not something that I think is a high impact card, but when I'm looking for playables, I'm trying to just kind of scavenge for what upside I can find. And I noticed that I think most of the hits from the Trap Finder are decent, and my curve could use a little bit of bolstering early on. There's also a very small amount of synergy with the band together, because if I get on the board turn 1 and I happen to have something turn 2 or 3, that's 1 extra power that the band together can hit. So maybe it can hit a 3/3 where otherwise it would only be able to kill like a 3/1 or a 3/2 or something like that. So I think this is where I ended up. And if I just run through, again, I could have tried the Warcaller version, but as we mentioned, I wasn't really huge on it just because I didn't feel like I could apply enough pressure to maximize that version of the deck. And then I always do like a quick run through at the end because my mana is quite good here actually with the treasure generations and the pilgrim's eyes. So I want to see if there's anything else that I really want to splash. Humiliation, I actually, to be honest, I have a hard time judging how much to value the lose all abilities version or part of this card versus the damage card. For instance, like my creature count isn't super high, and some of these things, like 15 is not bad, but it's not 20, right? And some of these cards probably aren't like I don't expect them to come onto the board early, so it's not going to help keep me alive. But the lose all abilities part can be huge, and is it worthwhile to play this and go down a card in order to answer like an opponent's threats because they're gonna have some in sealed, and the answer is I don't know, maybe, but again, it is white. It's the one color I'm not playing, so there's a decent amount of cost to including this. Same with Guiding Bolt, by the way. I think this is a very, very reasonable splash, and I was pretty tempted to give it a shot, but I thought that I had my large removals in like here and here, I thought were decent enough, the enthusiasm and the cast down. If they have a legendary thing, maybe the cast down doesn't hit it, but I thought that this was a very reasonable build. Still nothing in blue that I really wanted, no ETB stuff for blink shenanigans. Grim Bounty, I could see a case for trying to splash, but given that if I wasn't playing this, I think it's reasonable to include the double splash, but I would prefer to have consistent mana. So I didn't want to have the double black card and have this blue card, and if I had to choose, I'd rather have a 6/6 flyer. So nothing really here. And so this is, I think, where I ended up. If you guys have comments or something that you think I missed or have questions about the build, feel free to let me know, and I'd be really interested to hear it. Good luck everyone on their seals.